Mic check 1 2. It's the Y2K collector, and a question that I often get is, which console should I collect for? It's a question that I've gotten pretty much ever since I've started this channel, and there's going to be a million and one answers out there for you. But I like to think of the question in terms of which consoles or which console is the most collectible. And being the most collectible doesn't necessarily mean the console with the most games that you can collect for. Being the most collectible doesn't necessarily mean being the console that has the most expensive games or the most rare games or highly sought after games. I think a collectible console is a console that has a really good balance amongst all those aspects, right? Does it have enough games in the library to make it worthwhile? Are those games worth actually playing? Because you do have some consoles that have tons of games, but a lot of those games are shovelware, Nintendo Wii. So, you have to think about that, right? Then there's also the price factor. Is this console too expensive to collect for? Is it going to be too difficult price wise? Is it going to be too hard on your wallet? Then there's the ability to acquire the games, right? Are the games easy to find? Can you find them in most places, or do you have to are you pretty much relegated to what's on the internet or mom and pop shops? So the ease of acquisition is another factor that you have to think about when you're trying to factor in collectability, right? And then the fun factor, the gameplay. How much in terms of hardware? What type of hardware do you need to play these games? Is the hardware that you need for these games easy to find? Is it difficult to connect this hardware to modern TVs? Are you going to need a CRT TV, right? So there's a lot of factors when you start to think about, okay, which console or consoles are the most collectible? And I don't think you can just boil them down to, how valuable the library is or things like that. So there's a couple consoles that do come to my mind though when I think about consoles that are the most collectible, like, easy to collect for. And I'll go through just a couple of them with you here, just to kind of talk about it, right? So one of the first consoles that comes to my mind is the PlayStation 1, right? So the PlayStation 1 has a pretty large library. But the good thing about the PlayStation 1 library is that it's not made up of just all really rare and expensive games. There's a lot of very reasonable games that you can collect for on the PlayStation 1. A lot of iconic franchises were started on the PlayStation 1, right? And there are a lot of PlayStation 1 games that have gotten remake after remake after remake. I think the PlayStation 1 console in and of itself is very easy to find. I think you can, not easy to find, but I mean, I'll say this, you can pick one up on GameStop's website. I can tell you that. On top of that, you don't necessarily need to have a PlayStation 1 console to PlayStation 1 games. If you find a PlayStation 2, you can play most PlayStation 1 games on a PS2. And if you happen to find a backwards compatible PlayStation 3, well, then there you go. You can play PlayStation 1, 2, and 3 games on a backwards compatible PlayStation 3. So I would say that the PlayStation 1, just in terms of ease of acquisition, having a way to play the games is definitely there for you. The library overall isn't going to break your pocket once you start getting into those middle ground games that aren't crazy expensive but do pack a lot of punch. I think about games like, Threads of Fate. I think about games like Intelligent Cube. I think about games like Ape Escape, which isn't really expensive. It's a decent sized game. You could play the original Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation, right? So you've got a lot of options when it comes to the PlayStation 1, and I think that there's definitely meat on the bone there. I would say that the ease of finding PlayStation 1 games it's not as easy, right? PlayStation 1 is 5th generation, and 5th generation games are just getting harder and harder to find, especially disc-based 5th generation games, because those are very fragile. A lot of them are suffering from disc rot. So when it comes to collecting for the PlayStation 1, you have to ask yourself, are you okay with doing disc only? Because if you're okay with just doing disc only, then you will be in a good spot, and you may be able to survive, or have fun collecting for that console. If you're looking for complete and box PlayStation 1 games, then you may have a little bit of a challenge there, because like I said, it's getting a little bit harder to find those PlayStation 1 games complete in box. So the PlayStation 1 is definitely one option for you. Another option, and I don't have it here on the shelf, but I'll talk about it anyway, is the Sega Genesis, right? So I think the Sega Genesis today is very collectible. The Sega Genesis, in some ways, I feel like the Sega Genesis is kind of like the stepchild of the fourth generation. A lot of people think obviously about the Super Nintendo. I think a lot of people wanted the Neo Geo but just couldn't afford it. You got the TurboGrafx 16, all those other consoles that you'd associate with the fourth generation. And I know that, especially in America, the big console war was between the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. So you're probably like, hey, Y2K, why are you calling the Sega Genesis the stepchild? It was like literally number two. It was Super Nintendo 1, Sega Genesis number 2. I feel like, though, in today's times, if you grew up in the 90s, yes, Sega Genesis was clearly neck and neck with Super Nintendo at certain points. But retrospectively, like when you look back and you look at the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, looking backwards, I think we kind of look back on the Sega Genesis with a little bit of the stepchild feel. It's not a console that I think a lot of people are really gunning for. I don't think a lot of people really are shooting to pick up and build, these strong Sega Genesis collections. It's just not a console that I think is as widely revered as like a Super Nintendo or even an NES, or even like a PlayStation, an original PlayStation. And because of that, there's a lot of opportunity there with Sega Genesis games. I think you can pick up a lot of really good quality Sega Genesis games for not a lot of money. So the ease of acquisition is there. You can easily pick up a Sega Genesis console. Like I said, I see them on GameStop's website all the time. You can find them in most mom and pop shops. They're not crazy expensive. So the consoles are definitely there. The pricing isn't through the roof. The ease of acquisition is there. And there's a very strong library. The Sega Genesis has a very good library to choose from. I would say that the Sega Genesis video game lineup is actually better than the Super Nintendo. I know I might be in the minority when I say that, but I do think the Sega Genesis had a better library of games than the Super Nintendo. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the more popular games that were on the Super Nintendo, like those franchise games, they were also available on the Sega Genesis. So when you think about games like Earthworm Jim, yeah, it came out on Super Nintendo. It was also available on Sega Genesis. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time, there was a version of that on the Sega Genesis. Mutants in Manhattan. A lot of the beat 'em ups, some of the best beat 'em ups, honestly, were on the Sega Genesis. There's no Super Nintendo equivalent to the Streets of Rage series. If you want to compare probably the best beat 'em up series on the Super Nintendo, which might be the Final Fight series, against like Sega Genesis beat 'em ups, when you consider like the Streets of Rage series, I don't think Final Fight even measures up to the Streets of Rage series. You guys can debate that in the comments, but do you think the Final Fight series has anything on the Streets of Rage series? I'm gonna say no on that. I think when it comes to shoot 'em ups, the Genesis eclipses the Super Nintendo easily. Yes, you've got Super R-Type 3. Yes, you've got Space Megaforce. Yes, you've got some of these really good games, but overall, I think Sega beats Super Nintendo there. So it's not something that everyone's gunning for. I think the fourth generation fad has definitely waned. I don't think people are as hype about fourth generation gaming. So I think the Sega Genesis presents a great opportunity there for you as well. The last option when it comes to most collectible consoles that I could think of off the top of my head is going to be the DS, and it's going to be a handheld console. The DS is strange. For some reason, DS and 3DS handhelds seem to be going up in price. I don't know why that is. And I don't know if I'm seeing that reflected in the library, so to speak. But the DS has an amazing library. I'm not going to elaborate. I'm just going to say there's an amazing library there. All types of games, all varieties, all genres, RPGs, action, run and gun shooters, shoot 'em up, beat 'em ups, fighting games, platformers, whatever you want, it's available for you on the 3DS library. You can get your hands. There's so many ways to play these games, right? You could play a DS game. There's probably like, I don't know how many different versions of the DS there are out there, but they are plentiful. And you can easily find one at a yard sale, mom and pop shop, Goodwill, GameStop, wherever you want to find them. The ease of acquisition is there. The games are there. They're readily available for you. They're not crazy and expensive. And as a matter of fact, some of the more expensive games have actually gone down in price. So definitely got to recommend the DS. I think it is one of the most, if not the most collectible handheld in my opinion. And I'm a big PSP guy, as you can see. But if someone asked me, should I collect for the PSP or the DS? I'm going to say the DS, because I think there's just more meat on the bone there. But let me know what you guys think. These are the consoles that I think are the most collectible, just factoring in all the factors that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.